Hello, it's Craig Thompson, and this is the Stratford Slice.
I don't believe there ever can be a free trade with the Americans again. The signature of the President of the United States is not worth the paper it's written on.
This is not about parties. This is about saving the country.
This is an existential threat. Things can't be the same as always. This is going to hurt like hell. We've got to come together as a country, and we've got to save our country.
The last 48 hours has seen a dizzying array of news bulletins and news headlines. The tariffs are 50%. The tariffs are 25%. There may be no tariffs. Tariffs on this, tariffs on that. We have a car commercial on the White House lawn. There may be a ceasefire in the Ukraine-Russian war. There may not be. It depends on whether Russia comes to the table. And here in Canada, we have a new prime minister designate and possibly an election. It's really, really hard to keep up. So I wanted to bring my friend John Wilkinson into the podcast studio today to give us some perspective. He's got some deep connections into the Liberal Party in Canada. He's a former Ontario cabinet minister. And although he's not in the heat of the battle right now between Canada and the United States, he is on the board of the Council for the Great Lakes, which is a Canada-U.S. body that provides stewardship to our Great Lakes. So, John, welcome back to the Stratford Slice.
Well, thanks for having me on. Greg, we do live in very interesting times.
That's to say the least. I never imagined in my lifetime that we would be questioning the future of our own country. So it's quite disturbing, and it's causing a lot of anxiety. And we're seeing that in the rise of patriotism we're seeing in Canada right now.
Oh, yeah. I cannot remember when Canadians were so upset and so excited for their country at the same time. There's nothing like the threat of losing something to make you want something. So, it's like having two kids in the playground, and they're playing, and one kid is playing with their toy, and they put it down and they start playing with something else, and then the kid beside them in the playground picks up that toy. Well, then all of a sudden they really want that toy. So it's amazing how we take for granted our country until somebody wants to take us over. And my God, are we in love with our country again? And I think that is one. I think it's inspiring. It reminds me of the time when Quebec was going to vote itself out, and literally thousands and thousands of Canadians just got in a car and drove to Montreal and said, "No, don't leave.
We love you.
We're better together."
Yeah.
Yep. Forget about what all the politicians are saying. We're just better together. So I think it's one of those moments. But the thing that I notice is that we will look back and we are living in truly historic times.
And part of that patriotism is the whole Buy Canadian movement. And I noticed just outside the window, we've got a produce truck delivering produce to the little green grocer down the street. So I presume that's Canadian produce.
Well, it's definitely Canadians working. And that's what we have to worry about, right? I mean, what the Trump administration has done is threaten our economic sovereignty. His pitch is, I'm going to hurt you so bad that you're going to want to join us. And you really, if you'd been thinking, you would have wanted to join us in the first place. But he's failing to understand the history of Canada. So from a trade flow point of view, we're a continent where the natural trade flow is north to south. And we're a country that's kind of all the way along this kind of east-west border with the Americans. I think 80% of Canadians live within 120 miles of the U.S. border. But we decided, after having a front row seat to the U.S. Civil War, where brother slaughtered brother, that we were going to create a country east to west, that we would set aside the rivalry between the French and the English and create a country, and the rivalry between the West Coast and the Maritimes, and create a country based on east-west. That's why we built the railway, right? To connect the country, because we didn't want to be Americans. Now, that's something the Americans don't understand. And what galvanized that was watching the Americans rip themselves apart in a civil war, which at the time was one of the great calamities of the 1800s. I mean, it was literally brother against brother. The country ripped itself apart, finally came back together by deciding to have a country that wasn't going to be based on slavery. But the point that I was going to make is that we live in historic times because for 80 years, post-World War II, America has been the leader of the free world. We always say that. They're the most powerful country in the world. And they decided that they could make more money in peace than in war. When you have a war, it's a lot of economic activity, but the end result is to destroy things. That's what happens in a war. People are killed. Buildings are blown up. You're having all of this money go into consumption to be destroyed. In peace, everyone is working and you're building something. And the Americans said, we have to get engaged in the world so that there's peace. And so they created a whole series of institutions all around having people have peace, and that would be better for them and it would be better for everybody. And what's happened is, under the Trump administration, the Americans have walked away from that. Might makes right is what they've decided. We're going to be the big guys in our part of the world. We'll let the dictators in the other part of the world, they can do whatever the hell they want. We won't interfere, and they shouldn't interfere in our backyard. Don't mess around with Canada. Don't mess around with Greenland. Don't mess around with Panama Canal. That's us. And so we're going to walk away from the Paris Accord. We're going to pull out of the World Health Organization. We're going to be disengaged with the UN. All of this is isolationist. And the Americans have done this over history. The last time they were isolationists were in the 30s, right? So here's the thing that we have to understand. The world has changed, right?
In a matter of weeks.
Yes. And I think everybody's in shock. So what does that mean for Canada? I think what we've figured out is we're going to have to be masters of our own house again. Though we love the Americans, we're married to the Americans, we do business with the Americans, we cannot count on the Americans. Now, one would say, well, that's Trump. Eventually things will go back to normal. No, we've already done that. We had Trump in Trump, 1.0.
1.0, yeah.
And Biden came in and said, okay, I'm going to be re-engaged with NATO. We're going to be re-engaged with the World Health Organization. We're going to be re-engaged with climate change. And then they voted the guy back in again. Right? So even if one thinks that Trump is yet another aberration, and after 4 years they're going to put in somebody that's a bit more internationalist and not protectionist, we are crazy to assume that is what's going to happen for the next 80 years. Probably half the time the Americans are going to be isolationists for the next 80 years. So therefore, they're not going to be the leaders of the free world. And we're tied to the hips with them. And yes, we share a continent, and yes, we're friends. But this world order that has been created by the Americans, that's off. We would be, it would be a mistake for us to think things are going to go back the way they were, even though we would all want that. That's not going to happen. And that's why it's time for Canada and it's time for the rest of the world to figure out, what do we do in a world where we cannot count on the Americans? Now, that's different than the people. They'll count, we count on the people, but we can't count on the government of the United States of America anymore.
Now, speaking of the people, you talked about the U.S. Civil War. The United States is certainly a country divided, and many people have sort of talked about, at some point, the masses are going to rise up, the businesses are going to rise up and do something. But you don't see America being as divided as it once was, like during the Civil War period?
Well, I don't think there'll be a civil war, but I think there will continue to be a deeply divided society because people are losing faith in democracy. I have a sense, though, because of what Trump is doing, that it will force a new brand of activism in the United States. He is doing things that are deeply unpopular. He is doing what most politicians do when they get a mandate. All the ugly stuff they try to do right away. You don't do that stuff when you go back to the people. So if there's going to be tough medicine, no matter what the government is, you try to do it up front. And that's what he's trying to do. So Trump says, I'm running the game here. I've got a very kind of compliant Supreme Court, and I've got majorities in the House and in the Senate. and and I have complete and total control of my party. I'm going to get this stuff done. So he may not be as activist a couple of years from now, especially after the midterms. But right now, what he learned from the first time around is I just have to surround myself with people who quit telling me I'm an idiot and just do what I tell them to do. And if they get in the way, destroy them. That's exactly what he's doing. That's what he learned from the first time, because he understands now the levers of power in the American system. He didn't understand. He was a real estate guy and a TV guy. He didn't understand that the first time, but he understands it now. That's why he's put in what I call, the sycophantic cabinet. All the people say, yes, boss, how high? Some of those people, just like in the first, will eventually tire or can't stomach Trump and will leave. But he'll just replace them with some other Fox TV host who would be delighted to be a cabinet secretary. But there's only one thing, in my opinion, that constrains Trump, and that's the market.
I was going to say that. Let's talk about the auto industry and the investment community, because one of the things he wants to do is choke off the Canadian auto industry. One would have thought that the big three, the automakers, would have a lot of leverage over what decisions are made that would benefit or have a negative impact on their business. To move all of the auto industry and the parts suppliers to the United States would take billions and billions and would take years and years. And it would only open the door for foreign competitors from China to come in and take over the market. Do they not have the power they once had to convince the administration that tariffs on the auto industry are a bad idea?
Well, they did. That's why they
but
called
they're
them
still
up.
they're still there.
Still there. But here's the thing. So they've decided, can we take on Trump directly by saying to the Trump comes out and says, I'm going to put tariffs on everybody. So they come out publicly and say to the president, you're crazy, no way. Okay, so that's
like
Trump.
waving a red flag.
Yeah,
right?
So I'm not going to do that. So what they said is, hopefully he's trying to negotiate some better position. I think we figured out he's not trying to negotiate. He actually is maximalist. I'm going to win. In his world, I win, you lose. There's no win-win. So free trade is based on win-win. All the countries win. And he's decided that's it. We're suckers. We just have to win. The other guys can lose. Why do we have to give up anything? We're the United States of America. We're the most powerful country in the world. You can't do anything without us. That's his idea. And he comes from this, because of the way he was raised, there is no win-win. It's just, I win, you lose. Which is why he is just so, if you want to get him upset, just call him a loser. Right? Because, he was raised by his father, very domineering father, that the only thing that counts is winning. And
at all costs.
So we have this free trade agreement that's based on win-win, reciprocity, and everybody's getting richer. And the economics, that's what I mean about the marketplace. The economics say that to build a car in North America completely in the United States means that you have a car that's so expensive that it's not competitive. Our dollar is at 65 cents. You're building a car, parts are coming from Canada. By definition, because of our dollar, those parts are being bought in Canada because they're cheaper than having those parts bought in the United States. Labor is cheaper in Mexico than it is in Canada. The labor that goes into parts that are making a car in North America under free trade means that car is more competitive against Europeans and against the Asians. When you decide you're going to shift everything back to America, and you can't do it overnight, you can't do it in 30 days, it would take 5 years, right? What you will end up is a car that is not competitive unless you make it impossible to have tariffs, or you have to have tariffs on all the other cars, all the European cars, all the Asian cars. Trump starts with, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick my friends first, right? That's right. Us, without thinking through that if you win what you want, you're not going to be able to actually win because you're going to create more expensive cars. Now, the big three automakers called up Trump and said a couple of things. Because when he actually imposed, not just the threat, but he actually imposed last week 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 10% on energy, but 25%. That is the hinge moment in history that I'm talking about. That was when it went from bluster negotiation to the reality that the United States of America signed an agreement with us, signed by Donald Trump, And he said, my signature isn't worth a damn. I can just change my mind. Therefore, the signature of the President of the United States is not worth the paper it's written on. You guys are just going to have to get used to that. So what we have to get used to the fact is we can't count on the Americans. We can't. He's already talked about the border treaty, the water treaty. He's not going to change all of that, right? It doesn't matter that we've signed treaties. I'm Donald Trump and I can do whatever I want. You're just going to have to get used to it.
And we just have to wait it out and see what happens, because everybody's saying that if Canada loses, the United States will lose as well.
And the only way he's ever going to figure that out is the market. So the market is actually going to show Donald Trump, okay, you're the emperor with no clothes, buddy, right? Just because you put off tariffs for 30 days, just the mere threat of the tariffs, you are actually destroying,
destabilizing everything. Yeah.
Right. And so again, I just keep on thinking that we're going to come in, our grandchildren are going to take last week the point where the United States breached the USMCA, the CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, NAFTA, when they actually breached it, when Trump breached the agreement that he signed, okay, the world changed. Because what he said to the rest of the world is, you can't count on me. Even our best friends in the world cannot count on the United States of America. And that's going to be, I think, we'll look back and say that is a pivotal moment. And that's why Canada understands that there are things that we have to change, and it's not going to be easy. Now, here's the big advantage. In Canada, we actually are having a mature conversation amongst all the political parties that said, okay, this is an existential threat. Things can't be the same as always. This is going to hurt like hell. We've got to come together as a country, and we've got to save our country. In the United States, Donald Trump got elected by telling people that the stock market would go up and prices would go down. And right now, the stock market is going down and prices are going up because
inflation.
Right. So the people down in the States, they have been sold a bill of goods, and they don't know that there's a price that they're going to have to pay to
for
be
long-term,
the masters of their own little domain on this continent, as opposed to being the leader of the free world.
Right.
And so again, so the laws of economy and the laws of politics, I think eventually are going to catch up with them, but not right now.
So hang on to your hats.
Yep. Yeah.
So you've sat around the cabinet table in Ontario for many years. You have pretty good connections in Ottawa. How does one prepare to negotiate when you don't know what's going to happen in the next hour or two? It's all unknown. What is going on from the people that you know in Ottawa and Queen's Park about the strategy for negotiating when there's no rules of the game?
Well, you have to understand, there may not be any rules, but you have to understand what your strategic position is. And I think initially, everybody in Canada, including our political leaders, thought that Trump was just talking out of his hat about the Governor Trudeau 51st state, right? Yeah. But he's got it in his head. And what's happened here in Canada is we've figured out, no, that is an actual threat, where in the United States, they still think he's making a joke. I mean, I deal with a lot of Americans. I'm on this Council of the Great Lakes region. What we have to remember is, even though this is existential to us, there's just a lot of stuff going on with Trump. He, as Bannon always says, they're flooding the zone. Just keep on putting out more and more stuff, because you can get things to happen when you just throw everything out
create
there,
chaos,
and people can't figure out what the heck's going on. Because one day he's yelling at Zelensky, and the next day he's cozying up to the UK, and then the next day he's
selling a car on the front lawn,
right, yeah. With Musk. And by the way, that's not going to end up very well either, right? So
the Musk relationship, you mean?
Yeah, we've gone through this psychodrama before. Yeah. You can't have two egos that big. And again, the market is going to deal with Mr. Musk, right? His cash cow, which is Tesla, the stock value of that has declined by more than 50%. Meanwhile, his rockets are blowing up.
There's protests in front of his stores.
Right. So eventually, Elon Musk is probably not going to want to keep on losing hundreds of billions of dollars on paper while he's busy enjoying trying to take a chainsaw to the U.S. government. there are ramifications for these decisions that they're making that will all come back to haunt them. But the fever hasn't broken yet. The consequences haven't happened yet. That's why I was always saying, the best thing for us, because Trump's going to do it, is let him do it. Let the markets react, right? Because he's not going to listen to us. As far as he's concerned, we're weak. We're the guys who are going to lose. He's strong. He's the guy who's going to win. Just the thought that he thinks that it's okay that a bigger country can take another country over, which is what Russia's doing to Ukraine, what China wants to do to Taiwan, what Trump wants to do to us and Greenland and Panama. The world order after World War II was based on the fact of territorial integrity. We're going to just stop letting big countries take over little countries because they can. And that, again, is a pivotal moment in history. We have crossed the line. There was the post-World War order, and now that has changed. It's not going to go back. And so we have to be very clear with the Americans, and particularly with the American people. Americans love Canada, and by and large, Canadians love Americans. They don't like Trump, right? But it's not that they don't like Americans. I deal with Americans all the time, great people, but they have no idea what it means to be Canadian. We watch them all the time. Mm-hmm. They don't watch us. And so there is a reservoir of great goodwill towards Canada. We have businesses across, we have family relationships across. I wouldn't discount that. But the Trump administration is an existential threat to our country, and politicians are overall rising to the moment. And the next election, the federal election, that's going to be the ballot question.
Getting back to your comment about the Americans don't know much about us, this crisis has created an opportunity for Canada to tell its story better in the United States. We saw Mark Carney on the late shows. We see Doug Ford flooding the market. So I think from what I watch in the United States, the American media at least is shocked and surprised that this little quiet mouse next to the elephant is suddenly getting angry and patriotic. There's a lot of, even the New York Times has been covering Canada, and the BBC, and people are looking at Canada saying, wow, Canada really can have a voice and stand up for itself. They're paying attention to at least giving us a platform to share our perspective.
See, and on the basis that if we sign an agreement, that the United States and Canada uphold our agreements, and as I just said, that has all been upended by the American side. But based on that, we're their number one source of uranium, their number one source of lumber, their number one source of potash, their number one source of clean electricity, the largest supplier of oil and gas to the United States. Our economy is north-south. We are completely integrated. Free trade just made that even stronger. We either get along by having agreements, or they're going to want to annex us. It's one or the other. You cannot disengage the American and the Canadian economy. And that's why in Trump's mind, he goes, okay, well, eventually I'm going to win. Eventually I'm going to make it so bad that Canadians are going to want to become Americans. And of course, what he's realized, maybe he hasn't realized it yet, but the marketplace is telling him that's not on. That's not on. And that's why it doesn't matter what Canadian politicians are all saying the same thing, because they believe it and love their country. We are not going to become Americans. The one thing I always said, what is the definition of a Canadian? Someone who says they're not American. That's what we tell people. We're out in the world and somebody says, oh, are you from the States? What the first thing we tell people is, no, we're not. Nothing against the United States, but we're not them. We created a country historically because we didn't want to be them. So I think it's going to be exciting times, but we live in historic times. And now the question is, from someone who used to be in politics, who will rise to the occasion? Right? Who rises to the occasion? Just like that analogy about when we had a bunch of people that just rose to the occasion, and everybody went to Montreal to have a rally to say to Quebec, don't rip up the country. We want you to stay. We won that narrowly. Canada won that narrowly in Quebec. The first referendum The Canada side won handily. Not the second referendum. Lucien Bouchard had come back from the dead. I mean, it was an amazing campaign at the time, and they really had momentum on their side. And if it hadn't been for a bunch of Canadian politicians in English Canada saying, listen, we've got to go and just do something demonstrable so that people in Quebec know that we want them to be part of our country. And it's been wonderful. People in Quebec, I'll tell you, they are pro-Canada. If the choice is you want to be American or you want to be Canadian, the sovereignty movement, which had been gaining some strength in Quebec, Donald Trump has put an end to that.
Now the sovereignty movement is for Canada as a whole, not Canada in disparate parts.
Because you can be proudly Francophone and you can be Quebecois in our country, but you can't in the United States. You can't be your own linguistic, cultural group, a distinct society within the United States. That's not on. They're the melting pot. They're not the mosaic.
And we were been reminded of that when he said, we're going to make English the official language. There'll just be two genders, male and female, and all of that is out the window.
I mean, there are more Latinos in the United States where Spanish is their mother tongue than there is Francophones in Canada.
Yeah.
So I mean, they look at that and go, okay, well, we know what that means.
Yeah.
It means that we'll just be subsumed, which is why Quebec, Lower Canada, made a deal with Upper Canada, Ontario, and the Maritimes, and eventually British Columbia to forge our country east to west, even though all the natural trading is north to south. I mean, the Great Lakes region, we're all in the same watershed together, whether you're on the one side of Lake Ontario or the other side, we're part of an economic union. We're more connected to New York and Michigan and Minnesota than we are to British Columbia or the Yukon. Mm-hmm. That's why it's going to take nation building. That's why I like the project about the high-speed rail initially between Montreal and Quebec, building that infrastructure to tie our country together. It's a lot quicker to get from Toronto to Chicago than it is to Quebec City. But we need to continue to forge that east-west bonds between us. And that's why these interprovincial trade barriers are coming down.
Like building the railway 150 years ago, the same thing, building infrastructure that connects the country and makes it more cohesive.
Right, where if you just looked at it purely economics, you took the borders out of it, you'd say, oh, there should be high speed between Toronto and Chicago, as opposed to Toronto and Montreal.
Yeah.
But, we're Canadians, and we always have been, and that's not going to change.
Well, the bridge that's opening between Canada and the United States at Windsor, Detroit, was totally funded by Canada.
It was. I was part of that. I was in government when that decision was made.
Just what you said about the railway, even if we wanted to build a railway to New York, high-speed rail, we would end up paying the entire cost because the Americans wouldn't contribute to it.
Yeah, so I think it's we just have to, it's a tremendous challenge, but there's going to be great opportunities. There was a hell of a challenge to Canada as a British colony back in 1867, and we took that risk, that challenge of being subsumed by the Americans and being part of their great civil war, and decided instead to have our own country. Look at what we did when that challenge created an opportunity for us to create the country that everybody in the world wants to move to. Mm-hmm. We have a great country, and we always kind of hide our light under the bushel. But as I think it was Mark Carney said, they dropped the gloves first. So we're into it.
We've just witnessed a leadership event in Ottawa where Mark Carney got almost 86% of the vote out of 150-some thousand voters in the Liberal Party. Do you think that result, although those are just Liberal members voting for a Liberal leader, do you think that is the pulse of patriotism that we might see extending? Like, what do you attribute his massive, for someone who's never held political office, how do you attribute his success? Although he was predicted to win, but 86% is quite a remarkable number.
Yes, against the former Minister of Finance and Deputy Premier, Chrystia Freeland, and two other candidates, young Karina Gould from Burlington, who is a remarkable young woman, Frank Baylis from Montreal. So why did Mark win? Because the Liberal Party, which has a long and storied history in this country, at the end of the day says, got to pick a winner. And what they realized is that Canadians want to change. They were obviously tired of Prime Minister Trudeau, who'd won 3 elections and been there for some 10 years, which is natural, happens to all politicians. And I think and Mr. Poilievre was the beneficiary of that. Sometimes the electorate wants things to stay the same, and sometimes they want to change. And there definitely was change. Mark represents change, a break from the Trudeau years, without having to get rid of the Liberals, just getting rid of the leader and having a reset. I don't know whether it's going to work, but it is the best chance the Liberals had to hold on to power. And you can always count on Liberals. I'm one of them. They will vote for who do they think can win. And there was nothing like the polls showing that all of a sudden with Carney, they were neck and neck with Poilievre and the Conservatives, where before this happened and before Trudeau resigned, I mean, they were 20 points ahead and looked like they were going to go for a supermajority. For a whole bunch of Liberals to say, well, there's our best chance, and that's who they voted for. I was just going to say that here's this election, which I think is going to happen pretty quickly. You basically have a career politician in Poilievre, right, who is a very gifted politician, but never seems to miss an opportunity to prove that he's really doesn't have the ability to be prime minister. He is always partisan. He is, for example, Mr. Carney won. Did he call Mr. Carney and say congratulations? No. He's not that kind of person. Like he's just a political animal 100% of the time. Very, very good. Don't get me wrong. He's very, very gifted. But he never seems to miss an opportunity to show people that he's a really good leader of the opposition, but really shouldn't be prime minister. Then on the other hand, we have Mr. Carney, who by any definition, looking at CVs, is completely qualified to be prime minister, particularly in these really difficult times. But he's never been a politician. So now the country has to decide, do we go with the politician or the prime minister? And if people want to change, and if Trump wasn't around, I think you would have to give the odds to the politician. But in this kind of weird world that Trump has created, including in Canada, this kind of disruption of the situation in Canada, all of a sudden we're looking for a prime minister. That's why I think Mr. Carney has a reasonable chance of doing well, because I think he's got the resume to be able to do that. But again, one of them is going to have to prove, either Mr. Carney has to prove, yes, I'd be a great prime minister, but I can also be a good politician, which is required if you want to get elected. Or Mr. Poilievre's going to say, listen, I'm a hell of a good politician, and by the way, I can make a great prime minister. That's going to be that question. Who should be prime minister? I don't think it has anything to do with parties now. I think who can help save Canada? And I think that's going to be the great question. And those two men are going to go at it.
By the time this podcast comes out, the news is changing so quickly. We don't know when the election is going to be called, and Mark Carney is putting together a cabinet. But what I found interesting in the last few days is the discussion around what kind of cabinet that he might create. And there was some talk about bringing in people who aren't in Parliament. And there was even an outreach to Jean Charest, which has now sort of fallen by the wayside. But it's almost as if Mark Carney is reaching across the aisle to create kind of a wartime cabinet. This is, as you just said, this is not about parties. This is about saving the country. What are insiders telling you about what his cabinet strategy is?
Well, the first thing is cabinet will be smaller. Normally that'd be difficult because then you have to say to people who are in cabinet, you're not in cabinet anymore. And that people get their feelings hurt about that. But he won by 86% of the vote. So he has every right to go to the Governor General and present the cabinet that he wants going into the election. I don't think that the key ministers that are right in the middle of the thick of it with the Americans are going to be changed. I think of Dominic LeBlanc and Melanie Joly, who are really taking the lead for us in Washington. And both who come from very strong Liberal seats. So I think that they can actually be full-time ministers while still trying to get elected. So I'd be surprised if they were moved. but I think all bets are off on everybody else.
Even as contenders, competitors in the...
And normally, I think you would, there's for Christie, it's difficult because there is no position that she can have that would be more prestigious than the one she had, Minister of Finance.
And look why she resigned. She was offered a new post that she felt was a demotion and triggered this whole...
It's interesting. I was
incident.
telling people, and this can't happen because of the election and what we need to do as a country. But if it were me, I would send Justin Trudeau to be the new ambassador to the European Union, which is where I think our future is as a country. I believe that we need to be more aligned with the European Union because their values and our values align around healthcare, gun control, and women's right to choose, compared to Trump's America. We are more aligned with them. We already have free trade with them. So I would say that would be a good place for Justin Trudeau to be. He'd be outside of Canada, but he'd still be representing Canada. He knows all the world leaders over there. We need to forge stronger ties with the with the Europeans, and also with the Australians and with the Japanese and the South Koreans. And then the other thing I would do, just out of spite, I would send. I think Kristen Hillman's doing a great job as our ambassador in the United States. But if I really wanted to get under Trump's grill, I'd send Chrystia Freeland down there because he hates her and she hates him. And I'd say, okay, that's the Canadian ambassador. She'd just sit there and express how Canadian people really feel about the president. I don't think that's going to happen. But
no. What about bringing people, as I said earlier, from outside the political sphere? What rights does he have to do that? And what kind of people are brought into what you might call a war cabinet?
Yes, he has the ability to bring in other people. They would have to agree to run in the election.
Oh, they have to run. Okay, yeah.
Yes, and now if you lose, you can always appoint somebody to the Senate so that they're actually a parliamentarian. Right. But Mr. Carney is going to be the prime minister without a seat. It just as Mr. Turner was, for example, when Trudeau the Elder left. But Mr. Carney under our convention will say, yeah, but there's going to be an election. I'm going to run for a seat.
Where would he run, do you think? What riding would be suitable for him?
Well, what I've heard is that he's thinking about running in the Northwest Territories or in Edmonton.
Where he's from, yeah.
On the other hand, he could run in a much safer seat. There are Liberals who've been there for quite some time in what would be considered safe Liberal seats. So there may be somebody who decides that it's time for them to, they were going to retire anyways.
But the Western thing would reinforce the Western roots.
Mr. Turner, even despite the fact when the election in '84, when Mr. Mulroney came in and crushed the Liberals, Mr. Turner decided to run in Vancouver, where he had spent part of his life. And he ended up winning that seat, even though I think right before the election, everybody knew that the Liberals were not going to win that, and Mulroney was going to have this great big majority. But the people of Vancouver Quadra elected Mr. Turner. But it's difficult because look at the example of Bonnie Crombie. Bonnie didn't win her seat that she wanted in Mississauga,
and yet she was the mayor and well known, and
yeah. But again, she as leader spent very little time. She decided on that riding kind of at the last minute. She had local people and her people running that campaign, but she couldn't spend time in Mississauga, East Cooksville. She was expected by her party to be doing the things that the leader does, debating Doug Ford and doing announcements every day and being all across the province. That's what you have to do. That's what Mr. Carney, for example, will have to do. So I would, if it were me, I would say run in a safe seat, boss, and make so that you're definitely going to get into the House, as opposed to run into a seat. Now, and again, I think Bonnie Crombie thought that she would do better in Mississauga, but that was not the case. They didn't actually. Riding beside her, I think, is in a recount. It was that close, Mississauga.
But the Liberals now have official party status at Queen's Park. But what is Bonnie's strategy to have a seat?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know that?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't think she's asked anybody in her caucus to give up their seat and force a by-election, which I think would be a mistake. Because I remember when John Tory was the leader, he didn't have a seat in the 2007 election, but said, he decided to run against a friend of mine, Kathleen Wynne, in Don Valley West.
Yeah.
And he lost. The Liberals won in 2007. I was part of that. And then what happened is Laurie Scott, who had one of the safest Conservative seats in Ontario, Victoria Brock Halliburton, kind of the Lindsay area where Leslie Frost had been from, she gave up her seat for John to win it in a by-election, and he lost. And Mr. Tory's time as leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party was short-lived afterwards, because let alone he lost the election, he couldn't win a seat. But I don't see any of the Liberals giving up their seat for
Carney?
for Bonnie.
For Bonnie, yeah.
And I don't. But for Mr. Carney, he's the leader. If there's a seat that he thinks is the one he wants, there'll be no one who will get in the way. He's the leader of the party.
I was really impressed with Karina Gould. She's 37 years old. She's part of the next generation of leaders in this country. Do you think there's a role for her in Carney's cabinet, even though she was a cabinet minister prior?
Yeah, the thing that Karina's very good at is she was leader of the House for the Liberals, so she had to kind of go toe to toe with Poilievre every day, and I think there's no love lost between them. Karina is very, very smart and very gifted politically. She knows the kind of the give and take. Give and take. Yeah, the back and forth in politics. I used to always say that in question period, basically, if you're in opposition, your job is to pick up a brick and chuck it at the other guy, try to hit him, kind of like dodgeball, right? And what you're supposed to do if you're in government, I was in government, was, first of all, duck, right? Don't get hit by the brick. But most importantly, pick it back up and chuck it back. Try to hit them so that they leave you alone. So maybe we should use dodgeball. That's less violent than the analogy of a brick. But anyway, so it's kind of like dodgeball. Karina Gould's very good at dodgeball with Pierre. I think a great role for her would be to let Carney be more prime ministerial, and let Karina be the point person on
dogfight.
Yeah, she's very good, and he has a hard time with her because she's a very bright young woman. It's very difficult if you're a male in politics when you're up against a woman, because you can make a pretty tragic mistake in the heat of a battle and sound pretty misogynistic, and that is not a very good electoral strategy.
Well, look at Trump and Freeland.
Exactly. Yeah. That's half the vote. Yeah. And so, so I think, but it's completely up to Mark Carney.
Yeah.
He with 86% of the vote, he's the leader for sure. Now, and he'll either become a very, I think, effective prime minister, or the shortest tenured prime minister in Canadian history. Because I think there's a lot of people saying, buddy, become the prime, get sworn in, swear in your cabinet, call the election, call the vote. Don't try to go back into Parliament, maybe be defeated by the NDP, maybe not. Don't do that. The country needs, and I think everybody agrees, no matter where they are,
needs a choice right now.
We have got to get, if we're going to deal with the Trump folks, we just have to decide who is representing us, and let's get it done. I hope that there's probably better for Canada, there's a majority government. Just get it settled about who's in charge, because that's what you're going to need to go up against Trump for the next 4 years. I think that's what Doug Ford said. We need a mandate.
Yeah. Nobody has a crystal ball, but the polls are quite interesting since the crisis emerged when Justin resigned and all of the leadership. Some of the polls have them 10 points apart. Others have them closer together. What do you think about the polls? Is there a chance that Carney can pull it off?
Oh yes, yeah, and I don't think under Trudeau, the Liberals and his own party was telling him this. It just took him a long time to figure that out. This is that old adage, I think, by Mark Twain, that people change governments and babies' diapers for exactly the same reason. After a while, they're just full of you know what, right? So we live in a democracy. We don't live where there's just one party state. So of course, we don't keep on re-electing the same people forever. Eventually, we want to change. And in Canada, they said, okay, we need a change. Justin represented the status quo at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025. He's been the prime minister for almost 10 years. He's the status quo. People want to change. If you're the status quo, that means you're out. And so when Justin left, I think the party's fortunes improved because there were a lot of Liberals who said, but Justin, it's time to go. So he finally did what I think was the right thing politically, to leave. And then what happened is, I think Mr. Carney I think the threat of Trump, right, has made us think, who are we sending up against Trump? And again, Mr. Carney's CV compared to Mr. Poilievre's CV. Mr. Poilievre has a perfect CV as a politician, but not as a prime minister. And Mr. Carney has a perfect CV to be prime minister, but he doesn't have much of a CV as a politician, never had been one. And that's going to be the question in front of Canadians. What do they want?
And we have someone in Mark Carney who has the credibility of running the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, has a role on Wall Street. As you said earlier, markets, Trump pays attention to people who are in business, and we possibly need somebody who are.
But unlike Trump, he actually understands how markets work. Yeah. I think Trump didn't realize that what he was going to do was going to start a Trump crash, which is what's happening in the marketplace. The Trump is the worst thing for the marketplace because there's all of this, as Melanie Joly said, this psychodrama, like every 30 days, on again, off again. The last thing business wants.
They want predictability.
That's right. So in other words, you sign a treaty, you can make your business decisions because we have a free trade agreement with the Americans. Trump just threw that out by saying, it doesn't matter that I signed it. I've changed my mind. Business hates that.
Yeah.
They didn't want to take him on.
Yeah.
They didn't want to stand up to him because they knew that he would just, bite their head off. And so basically when he finally touched the top of the stove, right, when he finally decided to rip up the agreement, the markets reacted because they thought, I think, that he was bluffing and kind of negotiating.
Yeah.
And he's not. He actually believes that tariffs are the way for them.
But he's got some people in his cabinet, like Howard Lutnick, who are very familiar with the financial markets, but they all are we're not quite sure it's his decision. It's almost like they're his yes men that don't have any control or influence over what his decision is going to be.
Well, what they realize is that when they talk to him, Trump agrees with them. But if they're not the last guy to talk to Trump, he changes his mind. So that's the problem with being a Trump cabinet secretary, is that you think you and the president are on the same page, and then he'll just say something totally different.
Which is why you said earlier that people like Rex Tillerson, who were there in the first term, rapidly lost patience and left.
Sure, they had to. They had to. And it's why all of them, almost all of them, who ever served in Trump's cabinet in the last election, wrote a letter and said, this is the least, this guy should not be put in charge again. Right? Yeah. He is unqualified to be in charge because he is so mercurial. And because he is so narcissistic that he is an actual danger to the United States. And I think that's all coming true. And again, I think the only thing that constrains Trump is the marketplace, because for him, that's how he keeps score, And so markets going down means you're losing money. So that means you're losing. And if markets are going up, then you're making money and then you're a winner. And for a guy who has consistently bankrupted most of the companies he's ever dealt with, it's amazing that he's in the position that he's in.
So if you're saying Canada really needs a majority government to stand up to make a statement, is that what you're arguing?
Well, yes, because I just think that the country, no matter who wins, if it's a majority, I think they'll rally around the leader. I am no fan of Pierre Poilievre, and I haven't been a conservative my whole life. On the other hand, if Mr. Poilievre wins the majority government, he's my prime minister. Our country needs to be united. So when the partisan stuff gets done, it doesn't matter who's in charge. We need to rally behind them. I think Mr. Ford was the beneficiary of that in Ontario.
He's become almost the de facto spokesperson for. What do you make of what he did this week? He said, I'm going to cut your electricity off. And Trump calls him up and said, well, if you do that, I'm going to raise your tariffs to 50%. And he backed off yesterday and has now got a meeting with Dominic LeBlanc and Howard Lutnick later this week.
Because Lutnick called up, right, who is an adult, and said, oh my God, if we get into this kind of export taxing. So what Ford said is, you know what? You need us on your electricity. You're going to hurt us. I'm going to put an extra price on the electricity we're selling to the Americans. And so that escalates this trade war to a whole other level.
But were they surprised that that he said that? Because obviously it got Trump's attention, and that was probably the whole purpose, right?
Yes. My fear, of course, is that with us kind of in and out with the prime minister at the moment, the most important thing for Canada is to stay on the same page, that the premiers and the prime minister, we're a confederation, we're not a republic, right?
So you think Doug Ford maybe went a bit too far in being Captain Canada?
I don't know whether he did or not. I would hope that was coordinated. It has them getting back in there.
Well, there's good cop, bad cop. Like Dominic is more calm and rational, and Doug is sort of like the bad cop. Maybe it was coordinated. We need to get some attention.
Well, and what Doug has done is what no other Canadian politician has been able to do, which is to be consistently on Fox News, speaking to Trump's base of supporters in terms that they understand, and saying, "Okay, your guy is the reason you're going to be hurt. The reason this is hurting is because your guys decided to rip up an agreement that he signed."
Yeah, the other approaches were the polite Canadian approach, saying, but he's actually speaking their language and being the blustery U.S. style politician.
Which is great. I mean, and again, I just hope that that's coordinated. But I think Dominic LeBlanc and Doug Ford get along very well. And it has forced them, I think, the Americans back to the table, because this is going to be bad. And again, we in Canada at least know that there's pain that we all have to share to save our country. The Americans don't know that. They have no idea the kind of pain when they are, like 85% of the fertilizer used by American farmers comes from Canada. There is no replacement to that. We cut that off. We put up the price on that. They need our oil in the Midwest because the pipeline comes from the tar sands. There's no alternative. They can get it from Venezuela, who's a sworn enemy of theirs. There's no easy solution. There are things that we could do to really, really mess up the Americans, but they're 10 times bigger, Craig. And Trump's a nasty kind of guy. So there has to be an off-ramp. But we could be into very difficult times, again, which is why I think we need a strong federal government.
But the meeting in Washington with Dominic and Doug Ford and Lutnick, they had said, at least the Ontario statements, it said, we're going to talk about the USMCA. So maybe they're trying to find a way, how do we keep the USMCA in place, but find more ways to mollify the Americans? Yeah,
because Trump always has to feel that he has a win.
Yeah.
Okay. But here's, and again, I know this is not a popular thought. I don't believe there ever can be a free trade with the Americans again, because they have actually proven that it doesn't matter the agreement we sign. If Donald Trump is the president, he can rip it up. So this is the point. He wants to use economic leverage against us. The mere fact that he can rip it up to get what he wants. And we need to diversify ASAP away from the Americans. We can't, there's no way we're going to be disentangled from the Americans, but we have to have other options for everything we sell. They don't want our aluminum, which they need. We have somebody else to sell it to. They don't want our uranium, our potash, our lumber. We have to have other people, other places to sell it. Canada has more free trade agreements with other countries in the world than anywhere else. But he means to beggar Canada so that we knuckle under and become Americans. And that he just doesn't understand that is not on.
Looking at the dynamic between Queen's Park and Ottawa, Talk to me a bit about Doug Ford and Polyev and Doug Ford and the Federal Liberal Party, because Doug and Dominic and Mark Carney, they seem to be aligned, although they're different parties. What do you think is going to happen in terms of a federal election? Where is Doug's position going to be on supporting, speaking up for Canada, do you think?
Doug will speak up for Canada. I do not believe that the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario will do a lot for Mr. Polyev. I think locally you have good relationships, but I do not think Ford will take his machine and put it at the behest of Mr. Polyev. I don't think they like each other. I think that history shows that normally people in Ontario like to have one party in Ottawa and another party in Toronto. They really don't like it when it's the same party in both places. It doesn't take too long before the plates, the tectonic plates kind of shift. And so Mr. Polyev was not part of Mr. Ford's campaign, the one that we just had. I'm sure if he had been invited, he would have been, but he wasn't. Because so that's just normal. It's when you're in government at Queen's Park and the other party is in charge in Ottawa, you can fight with them and everybody says, well, that makes sense. When they're liberals and conservatives, they don't get along. But when you get along, then you're both being statesmen. I think back to COVID, Chrystia Freeland and Doug Ford, two people that you would never think would get along, became great friends working together. And when we were under the threat of COVID, that's what people wanted to see. Don't be petty little partisans, right? Like, do what's best. The country's under threat by this global pandemic, and people rewarded both of them for doing the right thing. It's easier to do that when the other party is running the other government. It's actually politically, it's easier to do than when it's your own people, because then it can be very, very difficult.
What can ordinary Canadians and ordinary folks do to help the cause?
Well, first of all, definitely no matter what, vote in the next federal election. It will be a historic election. We have to choose who is going to speak for Canada. I would hope that no matter what party it is, that we get a majority government. I have my own biases myself politically, but I think for the good of the country, we need a majority government. So that whoever goes up against the Americans can say, I speak for Canada, right? I don't have to go check with my minority government partners about what I'm going to say here. So I think that's important. And I think it's really important that we understand that history has changed. We're not going back to the way it was. We may negotiate a new free trade agreement. I don't think it's going to be worth the paper it's written on as long as Donald Trump is the president. And one day, if it's J.D. Vance, I don't think that would change, right? The half of the electorate will support a party that is isolationist and believes that they need to be less engaged with the world. That is a historic change. There are consequences for that. But for Canada, there are opportunities. Every time we are faced with this problem, Canada has become a stronger, more prosperous, more generous country, because that's who Canadians are. So yes, I know it's scary, but the opportunity for Canada is right in front of us if we can just decide yet again that no, we like our neighbors, but we do not want to be them. I used to always say to people that would complain about the way things are in Canada, I'd say, you know what? If you want to live in Michigan, go live in Michigan. God love you, right? But if you want to be a Canadian, be a Canadian. And I think the vast majority of Canadians all think the same way. It's not a partisan issue. It is just a question of patriotism. And, the true north, strong and free. We have to be strong to be free. And it's going to take sacrifice for us to become stronger than we are today. But I think people are willing to pay that price.
Well, on that note of optimism in a turbulent situation, I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your wisdom, John. Thanks very much.
Well, great to be on, Craig. And, I just think the analogy is right. They dropped the gloves. So we're into it. We didn't start this fight. They started the fight. And Canadians do not back down. We don't start the fight, but they decided to start it. And we don't have any choice now. The ref's not going to come and pull us apart, friends. We just have to get into it. At the end of the day, we're still going to be playing on the same ice rink with them. And there'll be many more games to come. But they dropped the gloves, and we just have to get into it.
Thanks, John. Great chatting.